Hello everyone. Thanks for joining this webinar presentation. So let me briefly introduce this webinar series that is coming from the IEEE Signal Processing Society Autonomous System Initiative. So today we're going to have a presentation from Dr. Peter Lewis, titled Perspective and Opportunities in Trustworthy AI. So let me just remind you that in 1 month, approximately 1 month from now, so at the end of March, we are going to have another webinar of the same series from Dr. Ajudani about socio-physical interactive mobile collaborative robots. Let me briefly introduce Dr. Lewis. Dr. Lewis holds a Canada Research Chair in Trustworthy Artificial Intelligence at Ontario Tech University in Canada. He's Associate Professor at the Faculty of Business and Information Technology. His research advances both foundational and applied aspects of trustworthy, reflective, and socially intelligent systems. So he's Associate Editor of IEEE Technology and Society magazine and the ACM Transactional, Autonomous, and Adaptive Systems, and the board member of International Society for Artificial Life with the responsibility of social impact and co-chair of the steering committee of the IEEE International Conference on Autonomic and Self-Organizing Systems. So he's published, of course, several papers, like more than 100 papers. I'm not reading the full biography of Peter, otherwise we stay here for the whole hour. So it's my pleasure to leave the floor to Peter. Peter, if you want to share the screen, and for the audience, I kindly ask you to wait for the question until the end, and you can put questions either opening your microphone or also writing questions into the chat. So Peter, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Lucio. And thank you very much for the invitation to talk today. It's nice to see some friendly faces in the audience. I'll just figure out how to share my, there we go, that's gone. Should be able to share my screen now. Okay. So yeah, so thank you very much for the invitation to come and talk to this group today. I often like to put this slide up first because it tells a little story about how I first started thinking about trust. So I'm a computer scientist. I'm interested in artificial intelligence and agent systems in particular. And I really, one thing that happened, I think, at least during my career, is that I've seen a complete growth in the role of AI in society. And I think, you know, we could spend the whole hour and a half today talking just about developments in AI that and our perceptions of them in the last couple of months. And I'm not going to do that today. But I first started thinking about the role of trust in artificial intelligence when I think I saw this tweet back in 2019. And this was a time when I think various organizations around the world started thinking about trustworthiness of artificial intelligence, reliability, the ethics of artificial intelligence based on a kind of new wave of technologies across society. And I saw this by, you know, this tweet by Accenture, a kind of major consulting firm. And I thought, wow, that seems slightly simplistic. Perhaps there's a little bit more to it than just saying, do you trust AI, yes or no? And I suspect any kind of particular poll we did in the room right now wouldn't give us too much meaningful to take away from that. But this made me start thinking, what does that mean? What's behind that question? What are we really trying to ask? How do people think about AI and whether they trust it or the trustworthiness of AI? And what are the consequences of that? So I'm going to come back to this, but essentially, so this is the framing for my talk today. I'm going to talk a little bit about perspectives on trust and trustworthiness in artificial intelligence. And towards the end, I'm going to talk a little bit about some opportunities when we start to think about AI from a trust perspective. And if you'll indulge me, I'll highlight a couple of new projects in our lab that we're starting that are exploring some of those opportunities. So before we do that, I'd actually like to start with a story to set the scene a little bit. So I don't know if anybody will recognize this photo. If you've ever been hiking in Wales in the United Kingdom, you might have been here. This is a town called Bethgelert. It's a lovely little place if you want to go off walking into the mountains and things like that. But I'm not going to tell you about hiking today. I'm interested in the origin story of this particular place. So it's the story goes like this: that once upon a time there was a Prince of Wales hundreds of years ago who was roaming around the countryside with, for some reason, he had his newborn baby with him and his trusty dog, Gelert. Gelert was the name of the dog. And he wanted to go out hunting. So what he did was he left the baby in the house and left the dog in charge of the baby to guard the baby from anything that might come that would be dangerous. And off he went, off hunting. And he went off and got a deer or something and brought it back. But when he came back to the room where he'd left the baby with the dog, he went over to the crib and the baby wasn't there. And worse than that, he started to notice that there was blood on the bed. He turned around and he saw his faithful dog, Gelert, across the room with blood all around its mouth. He was so angry that he took out his hunting knife and he killed his dog right there. Just as he'd done this, he heard from across the room a baby's cry. And he turned around and he saw that the baby was actually hidden behind the curtain. It had been taken out of the crib somehow. There was blood all over the curtain, and next to the baby, there was a dead wolf. And he realized what had happened was that the dog had defended the baby from the wolf. It was the wolf's blood that was around the dog's mouth. And in doing so, the dog had saved the baby. So this is a legend, and actually the town Bethgelert is actually Welsh for Gelert's grave, and he buried the dog. He realized what he'd done. He murdered his faithful dog and buried it there. And that's the origin story for this town. It's actually not true, but it's a nice story and it gives it a nice name and things like that. But I think it's an interesting story and it raises some interesting questions. So I might ask, for example, was the prince foolish to trust the dog to look after the baby? And I'm sure we will all have our own views about this. Some people, for example, it would be a perfectly rational thing to decide to never want to leave a baby in the care of a dog. And in fact, some people would say you should never leave a child alone with a dog, even if you know the dog very well. Other people would swear that their own dogs would never hurt anybody, and that would be okay. So there will be a difference of opinion in these different situations. So let's consider that idea that some people would say you should never leave a dog alone with a baby. So, should you leave your child alone at home, for example, with an Amazon Alexa? Would that be okay? Because what we saw just over a year or so ago was an example where there was this hit the news quite substantially, where there was a young girl, 10-year-old girl, who asked an Alexa for a challenge. And the Alexa challenged her to try to touch both prongs of a plug with a penny whilst it was half inserted into the wall. What the girl had been after was some kind of physical exercise to do because she was under lockdown and wanted to have a challenge, and she just casually asked the Alexa for a challenge, and this is what it had come up with. And again, so most people, perhaps, maybe, would not think twice about leaving their 10-year-old around with an Alexa. I suspect lots of people probably do that all the time. And not maybe aware of some of the risks that might come out. So, of course, Amazon responded to this, and it's interesting that their response draws on the notion of trust. So it talks about customer trust being at the center of everything we do. And they claim that as soon as they became aware of the error, they fixed it, and they're taking steps to prevent something similar from happening again. I'm not quite sure what, in general, given the state of artificial intelligence today, we could do that will quickly fix this, and in general take steps to prevent things that are similar to this happening again. I think that's something that seems like a nice thing to say, but I'm not quite sure that we have the confidence to be able to do that with the sort of technology that we're building today. And I include this because this is an example of something that many people would consider an extant example of AI today. So that's an Alexa, but of course many people do rely on and trust, or we can explore that a little bit, dogs, for example, as well, on a daily basis. So on the screen here, I've got an example of a woman using a guide dog to cross a road. And this is a place where, she's putting her trust in a dog to get her across the road safely. and that dog's been very well trained, and we can explore those kinds of things again. So this made me think, well, what is trust, right? What are we really talking about when we talk about this? And there are many, many definitions of this, but perhaps one of the ones that I found most helpful so far is actually due to Steve Marsh, and this is based on other definitions we'll get to in a minute. But I think in terms of an introductory and quite clear wording, this is quite a useful place to start. So it considers that trusting is a decision. It's taking an action, which is choosing to put yourself in the hands of another, in that the behavior of the other determines what you get out of the situation, right? So you're choosing to put yourself in the hands of, in this case, the dog, and the behavior of the dog in this case determines what you get out of the situation, i.e. do I get across the road safely? Do I get across the road at all? Right? Do I get injured in the meantime? And this definition dates back to Steve Marsh's PhD thesis in 1994. So when does trust become relevant? Well, again, I think trust, it comes into play. This notion of choosing to put yourselves in another's hands, when the action of the other determines what we get out of the situation, it comes into play when we can't fully understand, predict, or control what someone or something else will do, right? So if we can fully understand the system that we're going to depend on, then it's not a trust decision in some sense. If you can fully predict what's going to happen, there's no need because there's no risk anymore. And if you can fully control it, then again, you're not actually dependent on the actions of the other because you're in control. So this is the kind of the starting point for when trust becomes relevant. Okay, so coming back to 2019, when people started talking about trust and trustworthiness of artificial intelligence, and probably the first kind of major governmental or intergovernmental attempt to try and explore some of this was the initiative by the European Union that started thinking about. Initially, they were calling it ethical AI, and then eventually they called it the ethics guidelines for trustworthy AI. And the word trustworthy crept in during that process, which is quite interesting to note, I think. And there's clearly been a lot of work done by the working group for this in the intervening years since 2019. But they did initially define, at least at a very high level, that trustworthy AI should be lawful, ethical, and robust. And there's a whole load of things that flow from that in the subsequent documentation. And of course, I suppose, if the AI has been developed to be lawful and in a lawful way and in an ethical way, and the technology itself is robust, then I could see why a sensible, reasonable judgment about that would be that it would be more trustworthy. Many people might find it like that. Other people may not. They may not quite be able to understand some of the nuances of these. However, I think so. I'm not going to take a particularly deep dive on the EU guidelines or any of the subsequent ones. We have an act going through Parliament in Canada at the moment here as well around this. But I do want to highlight that I think some of the work that came out of this has been really valuable in terms of very practical guidelines and steps you can take and checklists and things like that around features of AI systems and the development of them that may well be seen as leading to trustworthiness. On the other hand, though, we have another sort of set of perspectives that are actually, at least on the face of it, that are in opposition to this. So, for example, Dr. Joanna Bryson was writing around the same kind of time about how no one should trust AI. And she actually goes further and talks about how to trust an AI system or a machine of any kind is some kind of category error. And essentially, and I'm paraphrasing here, her argument is that machines can't make promises. They can't be held responsible for their actions. And as a result, it's a mistake to trust a machine. So there's something going on here, and I wanted to try and understand a little bit more of really of what the nuances are here, and are they talking about the same thing or not? So from an analysis of the literature and the way people have been discussing trust, the notion of trust and machines in general, and other entities, we kind of arrive at, again, it's a bit of a simplification, a kind of categorization, if you like, of different sorts of approaches, perspectives on thinking about trust. So on the left-hand side here, we've got the argument that I just put forward by Bryson, and there are others who agree with this. I know people like security researcher Mark Ryan's put a similar argument forward. Alan Winfield has put some arguments like this forward, but other things he's written in the past have kind of been more open to trust. So that's why I have a question mark there. And essentially the idea here is that trust is not a valid concept when discussing machines. And no one should trust AI, only people should be trusted. On the other end of the spectrum, you've got people like Diego Gambetta, Bonnie Muir, Cristiano Castelfranchi, Steve Marsh, and for clarity, I put myself really with this camp as well, I think, which takes more of a kind of perspective that trust is this decision that you can make, as I described on the previous slides, an attitude you can use in a situation where there's perceived risk and you end up where the actions of another affect yourself. And if you accept this definition, this much broader definition, then humans, animals, cars, and we even kind of jokingly talked a little bit about rocks, are kind of are valid, for at least from the point of view of asking the question. How useful it is a different matter. But nothing's kind of out of bounds, if you like, because we have an attitude to risk in a situation where there's a dependency. You've also got some people who argue kind of in the middle, and there are a nuance of different positions here. But essentially, they mostly boil down to the idea that trust is valid when there's a sufficient level of cognitive capability in the trustee. So humans, some animals, perhaps even sufficiently complex AI systems kind of fall into there. And there's some literature on that as well. So let's think about where these definitions might come from, these perspectives might come from. And really, they come from some of the definitions that underlie the notion of trust. So again, I've quoted here from one of Bryson's papers, where she talks about trust being a relationship between peers, in which the trusting party, while not knowing for certain what the trusted party will do, believes any promises. So the two important notions I've bolded there, peers and promises. And that's really the starting point. If you look on the other side here with this broader decision perspective, a lot of this really kind of falls back on the definitions provided by people like Diego Gambetta, which look at trust being a particular level of subjective probability, which essentially is about whether you can assess whether another agent will perform a particular action or not before you're able to see whether they've done that, which is kind of the slightly more wordy version of Steve Marsh's definition. And in the middle, I think a lot of the definition here relies on goodwill and things like that. So whether the individual you're depending on is capable of exhibiting goodwill towards you. So we labeled these a decision perspective, a goodwill perspective, and an accountability and coordination perspective. There's slight differences in there, but this is a fairly high-level overview. So I think this goes some way to explain why sometimes when you pick up literature on trust and trustworthy artificial intelligence, you actually can end up in quite a different kind of discussion about what's going on, because actually some of the perspectives taken in these different papers are actually quite different and rely on different definitions. So I think that's the first kind of point that I wanted to make with this talk, really. So why are we interested in trust at all when we're thinking about complex systems, complex technology systems? And it really is the complexity is the point, right? And I've included here a couple of reasonably old quotes just to highlight how old this challenge is, right? So back to the 80s, there's an acknowledgement that most processes under supervisory control are so complex that they defy complete understanding. And again, if you think that trust begins where we don't have a full ability to understand, predict, or control what a particular system we may depend on will do. And even further back into the 1960s, we lack the mechanisms to ensure adequate safeguards. And because of the difficulty in rebuilding these complex systems to incorporate those safeguards at a later date, we ought to anticipate them. And I don't really see that much has changed, right? If anything, the systems we've built have become more complex. And I don't think the safeguards particularly are able to keep up in the same way. So basically what this is saying is that we ought to anticipate the fact that these systems will fail, and they will fail in a situation where we are depending on them in a situation of risk. And when we're in that situation, trust becomes relevant. I also want to highlight another role for trust, and trust is clearly a social phenomenon as well. And there's a lot of literature really on the role of trust in enabling the coordination and cooperation within groups. So for example, examples here are in the formation of norms, the creation of institutions. I'll talk a little bit about this later on. And essentially using trust can be a kind of a catalyst to be able to create cooperation that wouldn't be possible otherwise. And there's a lot of game theoretic results on things like that. Another one is due to Luhmann and talks about trust essentially being a kind of heuristic that enables cooperation to be less complicated and therefore less costly, because we don't need to check up on everyone all the time, right? So for example, I may choose to trust a bus driver because I just choose to trust bus drivers, right? When I get on buses. and I don't need to do a background check every time I decide to try and go to work. So there's a sort of social aspect to that as well. But essentially, let's come back to our kind of core notion of what we're talking about here. It's an idea where we're actually taking an action to decide to be vulnerable. So it's about willingly accepting risk in an interaction with something that you don't understand. And why is it important? Well, it provides opportunities that aren't available without it. So I'm going to spend a few moments just to talk about how we do trust. How do we make those trust decisions? And indulge me a little bit here. I'm going to go through a few silly examples. So this is my brother, for example, my much better looking brother than me. And you might ask, do I trust him? Right? Do I trust my brother? Well, honestly, the answer is it depends what for. So if I say, hey, could you please drive me to the airport because I have a plane to catch? And he says, yeah, I can do that. I would trust him to do that because he's got a driver's license. I've seen him drive. I've been in the car with him many times. I believe he's able to do that. If we got to the plane and suddenly it turned out that he was going to be the pilot, I would absolutely not trust him because he's not a pilot. I don't believe he knows how to fly a plane. So trustworthiness is situational, right? So he is more trustworthy in the situation of driving the car than he is in flying the plane. However, let's say we were in a different situation. We were now on a plane together and both of the pilots had fallen asleep or become unconscious, for example, and we couldn't revive them. The plane's in mid-flight. And he said, well, do you know what? I think I'm going to give it a go. I've played quite a lot of flight simulator games and I have a vague idea, so I'm going to try. Yeah. I might decide to trust him to do it at that point. I might decide to put myself in his hands, right? And that's because the trust decisions are also situational. Now, his trustworthiness has not changed. He's not suddenly more competent, right? But the situation in which we're making the decision has changed. Another example, let's say that I'm, as it is here in Ontario at the moment, we've got about 20 centimeters of snow outside. And I might be wondering whether or not I can trust, in quotes, my car to start in the morning, right? So I'm reliant on the behavior of this thing in order to be able to get me somewhere. Some people would say, well, is that really trusting? So there's an interesting phenomenon going on here. Because here, for example, in Ontario, I might say, well, you know, my car has recently been inspected by a licensed inspection station. I know that the person who did the last service was qualified by a Skilled Trades Ontario program, for example, and it's got this badge on the front of the car, which tells me something about that I believe about the quality of the manufacturing and design of this particular car. So all these things give me kind of triggers, if you like, to be able to arrive at a decision. And I'm sure in the countries that you're in, you'll have similar kinds of examples of those triggers. So this is a notion that we call proxy trust. So the trustworthiness has not kind of come through. It's not more trustworthy because of that, but it can, the trust that we hold in these people here, these organizations, can be kind of proxied through. So the car becomes a kind of facade for this larger network of trust relationships behind it. And that's what's going on here. So we call that proxy trust. One more example, ingredients lists are really interesting when you think about this. So we're all probably familiar with looking at things like this, right? So I've got, you know, corn flour, sugar, peanut butter, vegetable oil, and there's a big label at the bottom that says contains peanuts in ingredients. So what does this mean from a trust point of view? Well, I think what's really interesting is that, you know, this gives me the information that I might need in order to determine if this is safe for me, if I want to take that decision to trust the food, right? What the ingredients list cannot tell me is that I should trust it, that it's safe for me to eat, right? So it doesn't know that about me. And this means that my trust decision is personal. So trust decisions are personal. And what we need in order to arrive at those decisions is information. There's information about those things. So an ingredients list is a statement by a manufacturer or a regulator that says this is the kind of information we think you might need to know in order to be able to arrive at a well-informed decision. But they can't tell you that you should trust it. And that's an important point, because when we come back to artificial intelligence, we often see articles like this, right? So I'm going to pull this one out. It's a few years old now, but there are many examples of this. So to get customers to trust AI, show them its benefits. And this is a bit of a red flag to me, because you know, to get people to trust AI. So the word get there really jumps out at me and says, well, actually, we're trying to convince people to trust things by showing them the good things about it, right? And immediately, that's actually not about giving people the information that they might need to arrive at a good decision. It's showing them good things about it in order to try to convince them to trust it. And to me, this is potentially deceptive, and it's maybe disingenuous as well. So there's some theory around this by people like Natasha Dwyer and others. Talk about the difference between trust enforcement and trust empowerment. And essentially, trust enforcement tries to get you to trust something by projecting a particular image, right? Whereas trust empowerment is about giving you the information that you need in order to arrive at a well-informed trust decision. And I think this is a really crucial distinction that we need to make sure that we're making when we're talking about how we present our AI technologies to people. So we need information, not convincing when it comes to trust, I would argue. Okay, so let's look at a little bit of theory about how people actually make trust decisions and how trustworthiness affects trust decisions. So this model dates back to the mid-1990s, and it's become reasonably well known as the ABI model, ability, benevolence, and integrity. And essentially what it argues is that, proposes is that there are sort of three major factors of perceived trustworthiness that an individual will factor into making a judgment about that trustworthiness, right? This is subjective. And they're about the ability of the potential trustee to be able to do what you need. They're about the benevolence. So will that individual do something that's in my interest? And about the integrity. So if they make a promise to do something or say they will they follow through on that? There are then some other interests. So those three things combine into making a trustworthiness judgment, which is subjective and personal. And then there are some other things that combine into the decision process, according to this theory. So there's also something that they highlight called a truster's propensity to trust. And this really just draws on the idea that some people are simply more trusting than other people. So they tend to just default to trusting people when they meet them. Whereas other people, their default behavior is to not be very trusting until they've got more evidence that they ought to trust. So that also gets factored in, and then we end up with this, this trust decision. We factor in the risk as well, again, as perceived by us, right? And that then leads, if we choose to take the action to trust, into risk-taking in a relationship with that trustee. Of course, then what happens is there is an outcome. So either the trust is, either the baby survives or not, right? So the trustee does what we need them to do, or for some reason they didn't. And there's some outcome, and that gives us new information that we can factor into potential future trustworthiness judgments. So this essentially is the ABI model of trustworthiness and trust decisions from the 90s. There were other similar kind of surveys that were done at the time, like this one by McKnight and Shervany, around the same kind of time, looking very extensively at how people make trust decisions in business. And this model is actually quite similar. It misses some of the features out and it captures a few more. But essentially, you've got this kind of belief formation processes here as well, which are essentially the ABI part of that, the trustworthiness judgment. You've also got the dispositional trust, which is what I talked about before, some people just having that disposition that they tend to trust. And they've introduced here what they call a situational decision to trust as well. So situational decision means that some situations are situations where people tend to trust, and other situations are situations where they tend not to. So, for example, the bus example I gave before, most people interpret the situation of getting on a bus as one where you just trust the bus driver. That's part of what that situation is for you. Whereas a different situation, perhaps an unfamiliar situation, might be one where you're not very trusting. And in some, you might actually be actively distrusting because of the situation. So there's a factor there that comes in as well. They also introduced the notion of system trust on the bottom right, which essentially says that you can exist as part of a broader network where there are trust norms and there are systems, there are institutions in place that makes trust a kind of a characteristic of that group that you're part of, and that also factors in. So all of these things combine to arrive at a trusting intention, to the intention to trust, which can then lead to a behavior where you're in a trusting relationship. So that's the McKnight and Shervany kind of model that they developed from their quite extensive fieldwork with people in business. And essentially what we've been doing over the last few years, we're combining a few of these different models, notably those two and other recent research towards this. And I've got the link later for this, but to arrive at a general model that captures all these different factors that people have identified for trust decisions in machines and people and animals and all sorts of stuff, if you accept this decision perspective that I outlined earlier. And so they draw on trustworthiness features, which are situational here. We have competence, the competence of the trustee to do what I need them to do. One thing that wasn't highlighted in the two previous models, but is very commonly discussed in literature, especially around technology, is around the predictability. So is the particular trustee, the system I'm going to depend on, is it particularly predictable or is it unpredictable? Honesty and integrity. So we talked about integrity, honesty is around deception, and if they say they're going to do something, are they actively trying to deceive me? And integrity is more about if they say they're going to do something, do they tend to follow up on that? And then we have willingness and benevolence, which is really about trying to understand the goals or the intentions of the potential trustee here. So are they in my interest, or are they simply aligned with my interests, or are they not? And then we also have proxy trust decisions as well here, which I talked about in the car example, where we might decide that a really good example of this is a doctor, for example. So you might decide to trust a doctor you've never met because you know they've been trained by a reputable medical school and they've been certified, and there's good regulation in the country you live in around doctors. Right? So that might be a proxy trust factor. So these things get combined into the perceived trustworthiness that we then have. Again, this is still subjective. And then other factors get brought in as well here. So perceived risk, our attitude towards that risk. We talked already about the truster's disposition to trust and the situational disposition to trust, which come into play as well. And then this notion of system, or is often also called institutional trust, around the society that we're a member of and its attitudes towards trust. So all of these subjective factors then form inputs, if you like, to a trust decision. So we have a kind of a decision function at some point where we choose to make an action. And then as a result, we either end up in a trusting behavior where there is risk in a relationship between them, or in a non-trusting behavior where we've decided to disengage. And then, of course, we have outcomes. So this is our general model. And I'm now just going to illustrate it with two examples, really. One, I'm going to come back to dogs, since that's how we kicked off this. And a lot of people do some people have very, very strong opinions about trust in dogs. And I've experienced that over the last few years. So I want to draw on this. I think it's interesting. So I've got lots of examples of dogs here on the screen. One is a guide dog. One looks very violent. One's a police dog with a muzzle on, and one of them looks like it couldn't hurt a fly the way it's looking at you. So how might our attitudes to these dogs vary? So what's it like to trust a dog? Let's use our model. So first of all, we could explore the competence of the dog. So depending on what I needed it to do, I might believe in lots of situations that this dog could do what I needed it to do. Right? So if I needed it to get me a stick, for example, I know it's competent to do that. If I needed it to chase someone out of my front yard, then I would believe that it's probably quite competent at that. But there are lots of things I wouldn't believe the dog was competent to do. So again, it depends on the situation. Predictability. Dogs have some level of predictability, and you can increase this through things like training. But people's confidence and the predictability of dogs will vary substantially between the dog in question. And that's something that people often don't necessarily have great understanding of either. So there's an interesting question there. Honesty and integrity. I would argue, I don't think it's not like having any expectation of a dog to be able to make an agreement with me. I don't think that's in the sort of semantic capabilities of a dog, or certainly not to be able to honor an agreement. That said, I have met people, and I've given a similar talk to this, where I met someone once who was convinced that he made agreements with his dog, at least tacitly. So people often believe that they can, or they can believe that they can, even if that's not the way a lot of us would consider it. Willingness and benevolence. It may be like believing the dog's trying to please you, right? It's trying to do what you want in some limited sense. But also the dog has its own needs that may trump yours at some point. We also kind of know that that's true. What about perceived risk and attitude towards it? Well, I started this talk with an example about the risks of leaving children alone with dogs. So we may well be concerned about the consequences of bad outcomes here. But we might have all sorts of different beliefs between ourselves about the chances of that happening, and it might depend on the situation, myself, the dog in question, all sorts of factors. So this is, very much an it depends as well. Proxy trust decisions. So one of the key examples here is probably training, right? So if I know that I'm receiving a guide dog that's been trained by the Guide Dogs Association, then there's certainly an element of proxy trust that comes into that. If I get it from a reputable trainer, then there's a, you know, for a house dog that's reported to be safe with children, then you know, I might have a proxy factor there in my trust decision as well. So I just include this as a kind of an intuitive example about how we can start to apply this model. And I'd like to encourage people to sort of think about how this might apply to the sorts of systems they're building and the kind of relationships that they find themselves in. So let's bring it back to machines and technology, right? So how do these trustworthiness features show up in the way that's relevant to complex machines and like artificial intelligence? So this, again, this is kind of my interpretation of how these might show up. Other people will have different examples. But hopefully this goes away to contextualizing why some of the things that have been talked about in some of these trustworthy AI guidelines and things might be relevant from a trust perspective. So what information do we need in order to be able to arrive at a trustworthiness judgment? Let's think about competence. So the question I'm basically asking here is, can this machine do what I need it to do? Is it capable to do that, right? Are its capabilities sufficient to pursue the goals that it's got? How would we assess that? We do things like testing, verification, we'd patch it, we'd look for explainability. We might want to have an interpretable model, right? So all these kinds of things that we might be used to doing as part of a sound engineering process or deployment process, we can see now that actually what they're helping us to do is they're helping us to assess the competence of a machine to do what somebody might need it to do, right? Predictability, again, fairly standard here. So we might be asking ourselves, how predictable or reliable is the machine's behavior? So we tend to use statistical techniques over observed black box behavior here, for example. We also might draw on reputation systems, which is kind of a second-hand statistical model based on other people's experiences, and we can interpret those in the way that we choose. So we have some good tools as well for dealing with the predictability. So now we move into things that appear more agent-like to us, like some artificial intelligence systems. And let's think about honesty and integrity. So this is essentially its ability to make and stick to agreements. And you might think, well, what's an agreement with a machine? What does that really make sense? Well, you could argue that an interaction where you're requesting a particular course of action on the part of a machine, and then it's acknowledging that and adopting that course of action is a kind of, at least a form of proto-agreement. So I think many people would see it like that. So, I might ask, can the machine revise its behavior as a result of an interaction with me? Can I ask it to do something and then it changes what it's doing as a result of that, right? That's a kind of an agreement that's led to a change in its behavior based on what I needed. Importantly, like the dog with its own needs, do I understand when that behavior might change based on new information? Maybe I've agreed that my robot's going to do something, but then something changes, like its power goes low, so it overrides the goal I've given it. And do I know when that's going to happen and what will happen in that case? Does it just go off and ignore me and go and recharge itself, or does it come and tell me and ask me to do something about it? And if I'm happy, right? So you can see how these kind of interactions can lead to a varying level of understanding in when a particular system will honor an agreement, if you like, or not. And then finally, willingness and benevolence. And those who've worked in agent systems will be used to thinking about the goals of a machine, right? So, intuitively, I found a lot of people refer to this in terms of what the machine is trying to do, even though that language might make some people feel uncomfortable. People do think like this, right? So what are the goals of a machine? What is it trying to achieve? And then we can ask, well, are these goals explicitly captured in there in a way that I can observe and interrogate? Can I interpret what they mean? And then maybe more subtly, are there implicit goals captured in the machine's design that I'm not aware of? So if, for example, I've got some sort of machine learning based system that's recommending things to me on an online platform, do I really know what the goal of that machine's are or not? As I might think its goal is to make me happy, but it might have a different goal that's been put there by the company that's making some money out of the data, for example. Now I'm not saying that's necessarily bad. I'm just saying, do I know what that is? Right? And because that's essentially, at the end of the day, going to affect my judgment about when I rely on it. So there's a bit of try to paint a little bit of a picture here about how we might be able to contextualize some of the things that we're already used to thinking about in terms of trust theory, and how that might lead us to be able to reason about the trustworthiness of complex machines. So kind of to wrap up this part of the talk, so I've put up a slide with a bunch of different, robots in quotes here, various different types. And I might ask, what's it really like to kind of trust a robot? And the answer, hopefully, if you take one thing away from this, regardless of the model, is that there is no single answer to this. So it depends on the robot, it depends on the situation we put it in, and it depends on what we need it to do. And I would add actually to this, it also depends on who we are as well. So one person will trust something in a very different way than someone else for different reasons. And actually, when we start to think about, the very simple question about, what makes a piece of technology trustworthy, yes, there are some good general answers to that, but the answer will always be personal and subjective as well. And we need to acknowledge that, I think. Okay, so that's the kind of the introduction. And this part here is all based on a paper that myself and Steve Marsh published with that model last year in Cognitive Systems Research. I'll put the references on the end of the slides here for people who are interested. But I want to take a moment just to talk a little bit about some projects that we're starting in my lab, which is a Trustworthy AI lab, and how some of this is feeding into what I think are opportunities for us to really take a trust perspective on artificial intelligence and its relationship with people, and how this might help. So I'm getting pretty high level now, but just to give you a bit of a flavor of some of the things we're working on, and if anyone's interested, then please come and reach out. So the first one, I'm going to talk a little bit about accessibility. So trust empowerment, as we talked about, which is giving people the information that they need, or making the information available that people might need in order to be able to make well-informed trustworthiness judgments and trust decisions themselves, rather than trying to convince them, right? So this is all about giving essentially good ingredients lists, right? Good information according to that slide, where I said all the things that people might be looking for. Now, one of the things that I really kind of noticed when we started exploring this was that there is a real accessibility gap in what exists in terms of the information around artificial intelligence systems and their interpretability. In part, this arises from an educational need, because there is a kind of I think there's a big gap still in education around artificial intelligence, and the field is going so fast at the moment. It's kind of understandable that education and school and public understanding is struggling to keep up with that. I think we need to be conscious of that. But there are other things as well that we should be able to do better at. And one of them, for example, is accessibility. So let's look at explainable AI, which has been a big, core part of the Trustworthy AI agenda for the last few years, if you like. We should be able to explain the behavior of AI systems and the decisions that they make. So I've put up on the screen here just some screenshots from some kind of well-known papers in the area of explainable AI to illustrate the kind of things that people might be looking for. So the one paper, for example, Why Should I Trust You? Explaining the predictions of any classifier, was the one that proposed the line model of post hoc explainability. And if you look at this, the examples that it gives, there's one here which is a husky, and it's trying to classify between dogs and wolves, and it thought the husky was a wolf. And then what the picture on the right shows is that it shows a kind of mask over which part of the picture were factored into the decision and which parts weren't. So you can see from this that the facial features of the dog were not included in the decision. What was included in the decision was the fact that there was snow on the ground behind. And so essentially what this model had learned was not to distinguish between wolves and dogs, but it had learned to identify that things that looked like wolves or dogs with snow behind them were wolves, and things that didn't have snow behind them were dogs. So this is a really useful kind of explanation, right? That tells us something about when the classifiers learned something we didn't think it had. And that's one example. The one below that is something where we're able to essentially approximate a decision line in a complex space, because we're able to kind of zoom in on part of that space down here on this particular curved region and be able to explain the decision in what is quite a complex decision space by drawing an approximate line through that and then deciding which side of the line a particular data point is on. And the line is a much more easy thing to explain to people than the whole decision space. And that's one way of visualizing that. On the right-hand side, we've got another tool here, and you can see the kind of visualizations that are being used there. So where am I coming to with this? Really what we wanted to highlight with this, and what we started to realize, was that pretty much all of the work that's being done in explainable AI is around complex visualizations, right? And from the point of view of accessibility, especially from the point of view of the sight loss community, this is fundamentally exclusionary, right? So this is actually excluding a whole group of people based on disability from accessing information about how artificial intelligence systems that may affect them actually in fact work. So the project that we've got here is in partnership with the Canadian National Institute for the Blind, and very gratefully funded by Accessibility Standards Canada. And really what this project that we just kicked off last week is about trying to find accessible ways of doing explainable AI that don't rely on complex visuals. So that's something that, watch this space for this, it's something we're just starting to do. And in fact, I just put a few pictures up here from the first session that we held for this project last week, which was what we called a co-design festival with members of the sight loss community to start exploring these questions of perceptions of artificial intelligence, its benefits, its risks, and the things that people tend to factor into those. We had a really great week. And so that's something that we'll be exploring more. I think this is really crucial, right? So we already know that there are power dynamic issues in artificial intelligence. And I think we really owe it to the world to make sure that we do artificial intelligence in an accessible way. The next one I wanted to talk about is something a little bit more technical. So this is something that we're working on. I know you had a talk in this series by Nikhil Dutt a few weeks ago, talking about self-awareness. And self-awareness has been a key theme in my own research in agent systems for the last 10 years or so. And really, we're kind of trying to fuse this with the idea of trustworthy AI as well. So the question we're asking in another project here is, could we build AI systems that can reason about their own trustworthiness to enable them to be a little bit more socially sensitive? So that's essentially what we're doing with this project that's funded by the NSERC, the Natural Science and Engineering Research Council in Canada, around using self-awareness and reflective agent architectures in order to be able to capture models of a system's own trustworthiness, right? So we have a starting point for this, right? Because now we have a model that we can use to do this, as I talked about. It needs more formalization, and that's what this project is about. But the aspiration here is that we can enhance the self-awareness of autonomous systems to include knowledge of their own trustworthiness to others. And the hypothesis really is that this will enable more socially sensitive, kind of like reflective autonomous systems, in society, right, where they can do this. So that's one project there that is ongoing at the moment. And then I want to mention one final one, which is really about a real opportunity, I think, when you adopt a trust attitude to thinking about interactions with complex machines. And I want to highlight again this point that trust is not about the mitigation of risk, right? It's really not. It's about the acceptance of risk and when you choose to do that. And why is that important? Well, it's important because it enables you to coordinate between groups in a way that you couldn't do if you weren't able to do that. And there's plenty of literature on this, including, for example, some of the work by Elinor Ostrom, a Nobel Prize winning economist, who studied sustainable cooperation between all sorts of different groups around the world, everything from people living in forests and remote mountain communities to fisheries in North America and things like this, and exploring how they in fact managed to come together to be able to solve seemingly intractable problems like the tragedy of the commons. And people do solve these things, right? And they solve it through mechanisms like trust, the creation of norms, the sustainable enforcement of those norms. And all these things together come into what we tend to call institutions. And over the last few years, there's been a lot of work, notably by people like Jeremy Pitt, to be able to move our understanding of these institutions from human society into agent societies and to govern the interactions of technical systems. And I think this is a really interesting research frontier. One of our contributions to this was we showed using evolutionary game theory that trust is required in order to be able to escape from non-cooperative equilibria in institution formation games. And there's a reference to the specific paper on this slide. And this is an important result because it gives us some clues about how we could achieve sustainable cooperation in multi-agent systems, which we could then go on to apply to things like energy management. With someone in my lab at the moment is looking at sustainable foraging tasks for agents, et cetera, et cetera. And I first got interested in studying these kinds of things because I was working on sensor networks. and looking at things like camera networks, for example, with people like Lucas Estelle and that group. And we started looking at the self-organization and the kind of establishment of cooperation between independent agents in something like a sensor network. But more recently, it's become apparent that we can apply this back to the societies from which some of these observations were first made. So the project that I just wanted to spotlight last is one that is in collaboration with the Pomoja Institute and a food security group in Toronto called Unified We Grow. And really grateful for some funding actually from the Registered Nurses Foundation of Ontario for this project. And this is about using these kinds of trust-based socio-technical systems to strengthen cooperation in communities, right? So a simple way to think about this is, one of the major applications of artificial intelligence for probably the last 10 years has been a recommender system. And particularly in social networks, recommender systems are often used to recommend, for example, products to people, or to connect people to influencers who will keep people on a site for longer in order to essentially sell more eyeballs, right? So we're very good now at being able to use these kinds of technologies to create networks, social networks, and to connect people in ways that are, actually, honestly, good for advertising, right? That's what a lot of these systems do. So we wanted to turn this around and ask a different question. Could we design recommender systems that aren't there to put people in front of adverts or influencers? Instead of saying, what do you want? It's about saying, what does the community need? And can we recommend connections within a community that strengthens them? And we're working, as I said, with a food security institution here. And really the challenge we're trying to do here is, can we use recommender systems in order to grow trust within a network, in order to be able to solve food security problems in this community? So the example here, for example, is, somebody new comes, right, who has a specific ability to give or a specific need. And we want the recommender system to be able to connect them into an existing network to strengthen that network and add resilience to it. Maybe there is, another network that's here operating in isolation from that. And we might want to be able to bring those together somehow. So we could make a connection like this, for example, which suddenly creates a stronger bond between kind of key points within the network and then creates resilience again. So we're really looking at this from the point of view of social capital. So we've got like bonding and bridging social capital here, which was a core part of Ostrom's theory, and how we can use this kind of technology to actually intelligently recommend networks that are going to strengthen the ability of this community to be able to solve wicked problems like food security amongst themselves. So that's a very kind of brief introduction to that last project, which has started a couple of months ago. Just a little bit of some thoughts about some of the ways that we're thinking about using a trust perspective to tackle problems that artificial intelligence can help with, and to be able to enhance what we expect from artificial intelligence as well. So I just want to end by coming back to this tweet and saying, well, hopefully now, if I've done one thing, it's convinced you that it's a little bit more complex than this. I'm sure you knew that already, but hopefully we've now got a bit of a framework to think about that. Questions like this, they make good headlines, but asking, do you trust AI, is a little bit like asking, do you trust the human race, I think, right? So, nice headline, but it's pretty meaningless. Yeah. So some things to read if you're interested in this. Most of the talk in the model was covered in this first paper here. What's it like to trust a rock? Cognitive systems research last year. Some work here about trust theory that was published in Patterns as well a couple of years ago. There's a magazine article, Trusting Intelligent Machines from a socio-technical point of view, that was the result of the Trusting Intelligent Machines workshop. That was the published kind of outcome from that. A few years ago, it's 2018 now. And then the work that we're currently doing on reflective agents that capture their own trustworthiness. So there's a kind of early version of that on archive at the moment, talking about reflective artificial intelligence. Feel free to reach out on any of these platforms or by email if you're interested. I'd love to collaborate on any of these projects or other ideas that this might have sparked. But with that, I think I'll just leave it. I'll say thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter. Very nice talk. So I think we can open the floor for questions. See if anybody in the audience There's questions. Feel free to open your microphone and put directly the question to Peter. Or if you prefer, just type in the chat. Okay, as we wait, let's break the ice. Putting just a couple of curiosity from my point of view. So you talk about the explainability. This seems to be one of the, say, fundamental pillar, maybe, of the trustworthy. However, it seems to me that recently these with this deep neural network architectures, more and more deep as we go along with research. Seems to me that this explainability is quite far to reach, not so easy to get, especially in those let's say the latest architecture proposed for deep learning. So, what do you think? Do you think the explainability is really something that can be in the end reached somehow, or seems that is instead of, I mean, of being closer or being more reachable, seems to me a little bit far away every day that every new research work is published. So if you can comment on this.
That's a really good question. I think my answer is probably that it's both. So I think that from what I understand, most people maybe don't understand quite how explainable some deep neural networks actually are in specific domains. So if you look at, for example, the use of neural networks in image recognition and video and things like this, like a lot of that's actually pretty explainable. We like to talk about the fact that it's a black box and we don't know how it arrived at the decision, but there's been a lot of work in the last few years that have really kind of opened that up, I think, and there's some really cool techniques for enhancing, for explaining some of the decisions and the features and how they're captured in the networks. At the same time, I totally take your point that we're building things that are so phenomenally big. You think about GPT-4 or something that's coming next. That be able to explain it in those kinds of ways seems off limits, right? I don't know. I don't have a good sense of how far those techniques are able to go in explaining things that become that big. And even if they did, I'm not really sure how accessible those kinds of explanations might be to ordinary users anyway. So I think that's one of the challenges that we would have with that. But of course, most of the uses of artificial intelligence type technologies today are, at least today anyway, are not huge things like GPT, right? They're the ones that get the headlines, but it's the much more subtle things that your bank uses or the government uses to determine where to put public health resources, or whether or not we're running simulations to, plan out traffic routes through a city or something like this. I think we have reasonable expectations of explanations over those kinds of activities.
Okay.
That would be my perspective, I think. So both at the same time.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Thank you. Okay. Let me add another point, and then we see if somebody from the audience wants to put question. Well, while you were explaining during your talk about the trustworthiness of AI, it reminds me a project I participated some years ago that was about security in embedded systems. So quite a completely different topic, I think. But the idea based on that project was based on was security by design. So having put into the embedded system some security concept right from the beginning of the design of the system. So do you think we can think about for the future this trustworthiness by design? So a way to implement a new system, having in mind the problem, the issue that you raised, and by the way, do you know if there are any tentative for a kind of standardizing these problems, say a solution to these problems?
Yeah, that's a really good point, and the answer is yes. I think that that's where we ought to end up, is a sort of trustworthiness by design. And I mean, the work that has come out of the initiatives that in the European Union around that followed on from that 2019 report, I think a lot of that really was aimed at getting people who are building and designing and deploying these systems to think about a lot of these issues right up front. And that's really important. There is, in terms of standardization, there is an effort, I believe, being laid out of, it's in Canada that's looking at this, and the name of the thing escapes me at the moment, but there is a standard coming out of one of the research institutes here around trustworthy development of artificial intelligence, which is a subtly different thing, because it's about the trustworthiness in the development and deployment of the system, not necessarily the trustworthiness of the system itself. I think both are obviously important. And I think those are all really useful things, as long as we don't end up assuming that because we did it, therefore it is trustworthy and people will find it or should find it trustworthy. And that was really the point I wanted to make about the subjective and personal nature of this. You know, anyone who's spent any time working with, you know, say a small company trying to integrate artificial intelligence into their business processes, for example, will know that the kinds of questions that they ask and the things that they're concerned about and the information they want about it, probably quite different from the kinds of questions that you might come up with in a lab, and probably very different from the kind of questions you come up with if you're in a large tech firm. Right?
Okay. Yeah.
So I think we need to acknowledge the pluralistic nature of trustworthiness in the design as well. I guess that's what I'm arguing.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. See, there is a raise hand from Chris, please. Yeah.
Hi, Peter.
Hello, Chris.
I write a lot of programs and I don't trust any of them, even though I wrote them. I know everything that's in them.
Why is that?
Yeah, the issue is, how much do you believe that all relevant possibilities were considered in the construction of whatever object that is? Computer program, robot, whatever, neighbor. And I think that's a hard problem. I really like this talk because of that.
Thanks.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, please.
I come from the perspective of a software project manager, and I really like what you suggested, Lucia, about trustworthiness by design, but I can see that there can be some design decisions around what type of programming language you're going to use, what type of project design process you're going to use. And I'm wondering whether these may have an impact on choices made in the overall trustworthiness model which you presented, Peter, which looked like it could be sufficiently versatile to be address those sort of issues.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, and I'm glad you said that, because that's that was the intention, is to create something that would be versatile and, if you like, instantiable in different situations according to need, right? I'm curious though, I'd like to understand a little bit more about how you think that the choice of things like programming language or platform would play into the trustworthiness. I think it probably does, but I'd like to understand a bit more.
Sorry, I was muted there. I couldn't respond to you.
Thank you.
The reason I was thinking about that was because of the different properties that different, well, first of all, programming languages have in the way that they use computing resources. And secondly, things like the way in which the different types of ways the software projects are managed, and how the time of software developers is devoted to things like building trustworthy systems. So, for instance, if I am sufficiently trained in Scrum management, does it affect the way my development team carry out sprints that address different aspects of trustworthiness. But on the other hand, if I have no knowledge of Scrum management, and I follow a waterfall project model, do I keep falling over bits of the waterfall as I find that my ever-developed software keeps failing at different levels of trust?
Yeah, okay, I can see that. That's actually very interesting. So whether some particular development methodologies, for example, trip over various aspects of trustworthiness that we've captured in that model. That would be a really interesting thing to explore, actually, I think. I mean, I could speculate a little bit, but I probably don't know too much about that. I guess we're thinking about, there could be aspects of predictability. I mean, I suppose that the competence thing is generally fairly well addressed by testing, I think, right? And then we end up, especially in harder engineering, we end up with things like certification, where we know that within specific scopes of use, then, it has been rigorously tested according to certain standards for certain things. So perhaps there are other sorts of factors that come in around the things like the predictability, whether or not we've, you can build an agent system that has explicit goals that you can reason about and expose, or you can build an agent system that doesn't have those in a particularly interpretable way, right? That functionally might behave the same. Maybe there's something around the development process that would lead you to one rather than the other, and that might hinder someone's ability to, or help their ability to interpret the willingness, for example, of an agent, or its perception, the perception of willingness. Just speculating, but I could see that could be something that might not be captured unless it was explicitly defined within the methodology. It's more about how the thing is built, the architecture of it, rather than just the black box functionality, I think.
I think that's a good answer. I know I obviously have to look more at the model that you and Steve Marsh have developed, and I'll send you some suggestions when I've had more chance to look at it.
Sounds good. Thanks, Paul. Good to see you again as well.
Okay, thank you. Okay, is there any other questions or comments, or just curiosity? Anything to add? Okay, so if that is not the case, I think we can thank the speaker once more. So thanks again for being with us, and thanks also to all the participants for attending till the end. Okay, let me stop the recording